Chapter 3. Jill turned toward the door of the dim and silent Star's locker room, her arms full with two bulging duffel bags. She set them down and quickly pulled her hair back, tucking it into a well-worn black beret. It really was too hot for it, but it was her lucky hat. She glanced at her watch before hefting the bags back up, pleased to note that it had only taken her 3 minutes to load up. She had gone through all of the Alpha lockers, grabbing utility belts, fingerless gloves, Kevlar vests, and shoulder packs, noting that all of the lockers reflected their users' personalities. Barry's had been covered with snapshots of his family, as well as a pinup from a gun magazine, a rare .45 Luger shining against red velvet. Chris had pictures of his Air Force buddies up, and the shelves were a boyish mess. Crumpled t-shirts, loose papers, even a glow-in-the-dark yo-yo with a broken string. Brad Vickers had a stack of self-help books, and Joseph, a Three Stooges calendar. Only Wesker's had been devoid of personal effects. Somehow it didn't really shock her. The captain struck her as too tightly wound to place too much value on sentiment. Her own locker held a number of used paperback true crime novels, a toothbrush, floss, breath mints, and 3 hats. On the door was a small mirror and an old frayed photo of her and her father, taken when she was a child and they'd gone to the beach one summer. As she'd quickly thrown the Alpha gear together, she decided she'd redecorate when she had more free time. Anybody who looked through her locker would think she was some sort of a dental freak. Jill crouched a bit and fumbled at the latch to the door, balancing the awkward bags on one raised knee. She just grasped it when somebody coughed loudly behind her. Startled, Jill dropped the bags and spun, looking for the cougher as her mind reflexively assessed the situation. The door had been locked. The small room held 3 banks of lockers, and had been quiet and dark when she came in. There was another door in the back of the room, but no one had come through since she entered.
Which means someone was already in here when I came in the shadows behind the last bank. A cop grabbing a nap?
Unlikely. The department's lunchroom had a couple of bunks in the back, a lot more comfortable than a narrow bench over cold concrete.
Maybe it's someone enjoying a little leisure time with a magazine. Does it really matter? You're on the clock. Get moving.
Right. Jill scooped up the bags and turned to leave. Miss Valentine, isn't it? A shadow separated itself from the back of the room and stepped forward. A tall man with a low musical voice. Early 40s, thin frame, dark hair, and deep-set eyes. He was actually wearing a trench coat, and an expensive one at that. Jill readied herself to move quickly if the need arose. She didn't recognize the man.
That's right,
she said wearily. The man stepped towards her, a smile flickering across his face. I have something for you, he said softly. Jill narrowed her eyes and shifted automatically into a defensive position, balancing her weight on the balls of her feet.
Hold it, asshole. I don't know who the hell you think you are or what you think I want, but you're in a police station and...
She trailed off as he shook his head, grinning broadly, his dark eyes twinkling with mirth. You mistake my intentions, Miss Valentine. Please, excuse my manners. My name is Trent, and I'm a friend to the stars. Jill studied his posture and position and eased her own stance slightly, watching his eyes for even a flicker of movement. She didn't feel threatened by him exactly.
But how does he know my name? What do you want?
Trent grinned wider. Straight to the point. But of course, you're on a rather tight schedule after all. He slowly reached into a pocket of his coat and pulled out what looked like a cell phone. Though it's not what I want that's important. It's what I think you should have. Jill glanced quickly at the item he held, frowning.
That?
Yes. I've assembled a few documents that you should find interesting. Compelling, actually. As he spoke, he held out the device. She reached for it carefully, realizing that as she did, it was actually a mini disk reader, a very complicated and costly microcomputer. Whoever this Trent character was, he was well financed. Jill tucked the reader into her hip pack, suddenly more than a little curious.
So who do you work for exactly?
He shook his head. That's not important. Not at this juncture, anyway. Although I will say that there are a lot of very important people watching Raccoon City at the moment.
Oh? And are these people friends of the stars as well, Mr. Trent?
Trent laughed, a soft, deep chuckle. So many questions, so little time. Read the files. And if I were you, Miss Valentine, I wouldn't mention this conversation to anyone. It could have some rather serious consequences. He walked toward the door in the back of the room, turning back to her as he reached for the knob. Trent's lined, weathered features suddenly lost all traces of humor, his gaze serious and intense. One last thing, Miss Valentine, and this is critical. Make no mistake about it. Not everyone can be trusted, and not everyone is who they appear to be. Even the people you think you know. If you want to stay alive, you do well to remember that. Trent opened the door, and just like that, he was gone. Jill stared after him, her mind going in a million directions all at once. She felt like she was just in some melodramatic old spy movie and had just met some mysterious stranger. It was laughable, yet...
And yet, he just handed you several grand worth of equipment with a straight face and told you to watch your back. You think he's kidding?
She didn't know what to think, and she didn't have the time to think it. The Alpha team was probably assembled, waiting, and wondering where the hell she was. Jill shouldered the heavy bags and hurried out the door. They'd gotten the weapons loaded and secured, and Wesker was getting impatient. Although his eyes were hidden by his dark aviator sunglasses, Chris could see it in the captain's stance and in the way he kept his head cocked towards the building. The helicopter was prepped and ready, the blades whipping warm, humid air through the tight compartment. With the door open, the sound of the engine droned out any attempt at conversation. There was nothing to do but wait. Come on, Jill. Don't slow us up here. Even as Chris thought it, Jill emerged from the building and jogged towards them with the Alpha gear, an apologetic look on her face. Wesker jumped down to help her, taking one of the stuffed bags as she climbed aboard. Problems, Jill? Wesker didn't sound angry, but there was an edge to his voice that suggested he wasn't all that happy either.
One of the lockers was stuck. Had a hell of a time getting the key to work.
The captain stared at her for a moment, as if deciding whether or not to give her a hard time. And then he shrugged. I'll call maintenance when we get back. Go ahead and distribute the gear. He picked up a headset and put it on, moving up to sit next to Brad as Jill started passing out the vests. The helicopter lifted slowly, the RPD building falling away as Brad positioned them to start heading northwest. Chris crouched down next to Jill after donning his vest, helping her sort through the gloves and belts as they sped over the city and out towards the Arklay Mountains. The busy urban streets below quickly gave way to the suburbs, wide streets and quiet houses set amongst squares of browning grass and picket fences. An evening haze had set over the sprawling but isolated community, fuzzing the edges of the picturesque view and giving it an unreal, dreamlike quality. Minutes passed in silence as the Alphas prepared themselves and belted in, each team member preoccupied with their own thoughts. With any luck, the Bravo team's helicopter had only suffered a minor mechanical failure. Forrest would have set down in one of the scraggly open fields that dotted the forest and was more than likely up to his elbows in grease by now, cursing at the engine as they waited for the Alphas to show. Without the bird in working order, Marini wouldn't have started the proposed search. The alternative? Chris grimaced, not wanting to consider the alternative. He'd once seen the aftermath of a serious copter crash back in the Air Force. Pilot error had led to the fall of a Huey carrying 11 men and women to a training mission. By the time the rescue crew had arrived, there had been nothing but charred, smoking bones amidst the fiery debris, the sweet, sticky smell of gasoline-roasted flesh heavy in the blackened air. Even the ground had been burning, and that was the image that had haunted his dreams for months afterward. The earth on fire, and the chemical flames devouring the very soil beneath his feet. There was a slight dip in their altitude as Brad adjusted the rotor pitch, jolting him out of the unpleasant memory. The ragged outskirts of Raccoon Forest slipped by below, the orange markers of the police blockade standing out against the thick, muted green of the trees. Twilight was finally setting in, the forest growing heavy with shadow. ETA, 3 minutes, Brad called back, and Chris looked around the cabin, noting the silent, grim expressions of his teammates. Joseph had tied a bandana over his head and was intently relacing his boots. Barry was gently rubbing a soft cloth over his beloved Colt Python, staring out of the hatchway window. He turned his head to look at Jill and was surprised to see her staring back at him thoughtfully. She was sitting on the same bench as him, and she smiled briefly, almost nervously as he caught her gaze. Abruptly, she unhooked her belt and moved to sit next to him. He caught a faint scent of her skin, a clean, soapy smell.
Chris, what you've been saying lately about the external factors in these cases.
Her voice was pitched so low that he had to lean in to hear her over the throbbing of the engine. She glanced quickly around at the others, as if to make sure no one else was listening, and then looked into his eyes, her own carefully guarded.
I think you might be on the right track,
She said softly.
and I'm starting to think it might not be a good idea to talk about it.
Chris's throat suddenly felt dry. Did something happen? Jill shook her head, her finely chiseled features giving away nothing.
No. I've just been thinking that maybe you should watch what you say. Maybe not everyone listening is on the right side of this.
Chris frowned, not sure what she was trying to tell him. Well, the only people I've talked to are on the job. Her gaze didn't falter, and he realized suddenly what she was implying. Jesus. And here I thought I was paranoid. Look, Jill, I know these people. And even if I didn't, the stars have psych profiles on every member, history checks, personal references. There's no way it could happen. Jill sighed.
Look, forget I said anything. Just watch yourself, that's all.
Wesker called to them from the front. All right, kids, look lively. We're coming up on Sector 22. They could be anywhere. At Wesker's interruption, Jill gave him a final sharp glance before moving to one of the windows. Chris followed, while Joseph and Barry took up their search on the other side of the cabin. Looking out the small window, he scanned the deepening dusk on automatic, thinking about what Jill had said. He supposed he should be grateful that he wasn't the only one who suspected some sort of a cover-up. But why hadn't she said anything before? And to warn him against the stars? She knows something. She had to. It was the only explanation that made any sense. He decided that after they picked up Bravo, he'd talk to her again, and try to convince her that going to Wesker was probably going to be her best bet. With the both of them pushing, the captain would have to listen. He stared out at the seemingly endless sea of trees as the helicopter skimmed lower, forcing his attention to the search. The Spencer estate had to be close, though he couldn't see it in the fading light. Thoughts of Billy, Umbrella, and now Jill's strange warning circled through his exhaustion, trying to break his focus. But he refused to give in. He was still worried about the Bravos, though as the tree swept by, he was becoming more and more convinced that they weren't in any real trouble. More than likely, it was probably nothing worse than a crossed wire, and Forrest had just shut it down to make repairs. But then he saw it less than a mile away, even as Jill pointed and spoke, and his concern turned to cold dread.
Look, Chris!
An oily plume of black smoke boiled up through the last remnants of daylight, staining the sky like a promise of death. Oh no. Barry clenched his jaw, staring at the stream of smoke that rose up from the trees, feeling sick to his stomach. Captain, 2 o'clock sharp. Chris called, and then they were turning, heading for the dark smudge that can only mean one thing: a crash. Wesker moved back into the cabin, still wearing his shades. He stepped to the window and spoke quietly, his voice subdued. Let's not assume the worst here. There's a possibility that the fire broke out after they landed, or that they started the fire on purpose, as a signal. Barry wished they could believe him, but even Wesker had to know better. With the copter shut down, the fire starting on its own was unlikely, and if the Bravos wanted to signal, they would have used flares.
Besides, wood doesn't make that kind of smoke.
Whatever it is, we won't know until we get there. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your full attention, please. Barry turned away from the window and saw the others do the same. Chris, Jill, and Joseph all had the same look, and Barry was pretty sure he had the exact same expression: shock. Stars sometimes got hurt in the line of duty. It was part of the job. But accidents like this... Wesker's only visible sign of distress was the set of his mouth, a thin, grim line set against his tan skin. Listen up. We got people down in a possibly hostile environment. I want all of you armed, and I want an organized approach. A standard fan as soon as we set down. Barry, you take point. Barry nodded as he pulled himself together. Wesker was right. Now was not the time to get emotional. Brad's going to set us down as close to the site as he can get, which looks like a small clearing about 50 meters south of their last coordinates. He'll stay with the bird and keep it warm in case of trouble. Any questions? Nobody spoke, and Wesker nodded briskly. Good. Barry, load us up. We can leave the rest of the gear on board and come back for it if needed. The captain stepped to the front to talk with Brad, while Jill, Chris, and Joseph turned to Barry. As the weapons specialist, he checked the firearms in and out to each STARS team member and kept them in prime condition. Barry turned to the cabinet next to the outer hatch and unhooked the latch, exposing 6 Beretta 9mm handguns on a metal rack, clean and sighted only yesterday. Each weapon held 15 rounds, semi-jacketed hollow points. It was a good gun, though Barry preferred his Python, a lot bigger punch with .357 rounds. He quickly distributed the weapons, passing out 3 loaded clips with each. Really hoping we don't need these, Joseph said as he slapped in a clip, and Barry nodded in agreement. Just because he paid his dues to the NRA didn't mean he was some trigger-happy dumbass looking to kill. He just liked guns. Wesker joined them again, and the 5 of them stood at the hatch, waiting for Brad to bring them in. As they neared the plume of smoke, the helicopter's whirling blades pushed it down and out, creating a black fog that blended into the heavy shadows of the trees. Any chance of spotting the downed vehicle from the air was lost to the smoke and dusk. Brad swung them around and settled the bird into a scrappy patch of tall grass, snapping wildly from the forced wind. Even as the rails wobbled to the ground, Barry had his hand on the latch, ready to move out. A warm hand fell on his shoulder. Barry turned to see Chris looking at him intently. "We're right behind you, bud," Chris said, and Barry nodded. He wasn't worried, not with the Alphas backing him up. All he was concerned with was the Bravo team's situation. Rico Marini was a good friend of his. Marini's wife had babysat for the girls more times than Barry could count, and was friends with Kathy. The thought of him dead to a stupid mechanical screw-up?
Hang on, buddy. We're coming.
One hand on the butt of his Colt, Barry pulled the handle and stepped out into the humid, whipping twilight of Raccoon Forest, ready for anything.